I am going to introduce our keynote speaker for today, our very own Arnie Epstein, who is probably very familiar to many of you here, who's been with Elders Climate Action, I believe, from the beginning and serves on our leadership team, and also as a facilitator of our research team, and is I think of him as a climate scholar, quite frankly, given the amount of time and energy he puts into studying climate issues in great depth. But Arnie does more than that. He chairs the Green Advisory Committee in the town of Stowe, where he's been instrumental in advancing climate actions. Stowe was the 16th community to adopt the Specialized Energy Code. The town was among the first 19 communities designated a Green Communities Climate Leader, and they were recognized as the Leading by Example community in 2025. And I expect Arnie had a lot to do with that. So, Arnie, you're on. Arnie's going to be talking, I don't know, for 45 minutes, an hour, but he's going to break between sections. So you'll be able to have a chance to jump in after each section, and then we'll have a little time at the end for a more broad discussion. So, Arnie?
Thank you, Roger. Thank you for the introduction. I am going to share a screen and I hope this is going to work. So do people see the screen? Okay, good. So the title of this presentation is Achieving Massachusetts Climate Goals. What are our challenges and opportunities? And I'm sure you're all aware of the challenges or many of them. So the topics we're going to cover today are starting out with the roadmap legislation back in 2021. Actually, you're probably aware that there was an original Global Warming Solutions Act back in 2008, but we won't be speaking to that today. Something that I'm calling the perfect storm. We'll talk about that in more detail. Then we'll switch to how we believe we're doing today, and then finally what we can do to accelerate progress. So just a brief recap on what we've been calling the roadmap legislation that was adopted in 2021. At the time, and probably it may still be the case, that the roadmap legislation was the most ambitious climate goals in the nation, very ambitious goals for 2030, and I'm sure, as you're aware, for 2050, the goal is net zero. At the time the legislation was adopted, we were in a period of very strong state, federal, and international support for combating climate change. And importantly, public support was at an all-time high at that point. Now, this is just a graph showing briefly, where we were. As you may be aware, our greenhouse gas emissions targets are based on a 1990 baseline. So this graph shows you our emissions back through that baseline year, up through 2020, and then showing what our targets are for 2025 and 2030. And it's broken down into the three primary components of emissions in the state, and that's electricity, buildings, and transportation. And I just to call to your attention, through 2020, when the Global Warming Solutions Act had a target of a 25% reduction relative to our 1990 baseline, virtually all the emissions reduction was in the electric sector. You can see that's that green bar at the top. And you can see how much that was reduced between 1990 and 2020. The orange and blue bars, which represent buildings and transportation, barely moved. Transportation made essentially no progress in reducing emissions during that period of time, and buildings a very modest amount of progress. To achieve our 2025 and more importantly, our 2030 targets, that can no longer be the case. Both the buildings and the transportation sector have to make the lion's share of our emissions reduction. The electricity has to also be reduced, but it no longer is going to play the major role as it did through 2020. So what is the perfect storm that I'm talking about? So I've broken it up into 4 components. COVID-19, sort of resulting from COVID-19, a period of high inflation, high interest rates, and high unemployment. Then obviously we have the Trump administration, and then more recently, energy affordability has become a key topic countrywide, but particularly in our state. And just to break down the impact of COVID a little bit more, if you can remember back to that period of time, the economy almost came to a standstill. So we all heard the word supply chains and how supply chains got disrupted. Things were not being manufactured, things were not being transported. So demand exceeded supply because of this shortage of materials. Factories have been shut down. Shipping costs, whether by sea or land, climbed. As a result of all that, we had a surge of inflation. I'm sure you all remember that period of time when inflation surged to 20% or more, and unemployment spiked to, I think it was above 14% for a period of time. So as an example of what the impact of COVID and the resulting impact on the economy were, we'll take a quick look at what happened with offshore wind. And we'll get to this later, the targets that we have in the electric sector for 2030, we're looking to offshore wind to play probably the lion's share of our ability to meet those targets. And at a couple of years after the roadmap bill was passed, there were contracts in place for 3,200 megawatts of offshore wind, which would have met the target that the modeling results of the CECP had to achieve our emissions reduction in the electric sector. Now, what happened was after those contracts were signed, all but one of them was terminated, and that was for Vineyard Wind, so-called Vineyard Wind 1. The other 2 larger projects, they went through several names, but one was called South Coast Wind, and the other was Commonwealth Wind, each at about 1,200 megawatts. And both of those projects, the lead developer for those projects, after those supply chain issues and interest rate climbed and inflation climbed, they took a look at what they had contracted for, what was called their power purchase agreements, which are listed above, $77 per megawatt hour and $72 per megawatt hour respectively, and said that the project was no longer viable at that contract rate. And they consequently terminated the contracts for those 2 projects in 2023. Since that time, there's been negotiations to restart those projects. There's obviously the Trump administration's war against renewables, which has made this a very difficult project. But in addition to that, because of all of the issues that I mentioned earlier, what we're anticipating is that the contract price for electricity for those two projects will probably be around double what it was at the time those contracts were initially signed. There is one project that's moving forward in New York, and its contract price is essentially double what the original contract price was for those two projects. So in one sector, in the electric sector, we took a really big blow from what happened as a result of COVID impacting the economy. Now we're going to switch to the Trump administration. Off the top of my head, I just listed, several of the many issues that have been, have and continue to make the fight against climate change more and more difficult. I don't think I need to spend much more time on that. I think you're all aware that this has been just a really difficult period to make progress. And more recently, we have come up to what is called the energy affordability issue. And I think if you're reading the news fairly regularly, you're aware that energy costs have increased all over the country. It's not just Massachusetts. But Massachusetts energy costs actually increased significantly more than the average across the country. We started out with higher energy costs than the rest of the country on average, and now we have for electricity, I think it's the third highest electric rates in the country, and I don't know if that's also the case for gas and fuel oil, but they're up there as well. And it's gotten to the point where a recent poll showed that residents of Massachusetts now view energy costs as their highest concern, and for good reason. And the result of that is that, the administration and the legislature now has taken up the banner of energy affordability, both to reduce the burden on residents, which is key, but also taking it up as a political issue for the next the midterm elections and going forward. So the focus has become reducing energy costs in the near term. And I'm sure, have seen how that's playing out in terms of legislation this session with energy affordability bills from the governor and from the House, and we're going to be seeing one from the Senate in the not too distant future. And one of the things they're keying off on with these energy affordability bills is how can they reduce the burden of energy costs on residents in the here and now, in the near term. So issues like the policies that are in place for energy efficiency and clean energy, which will reduce energy costs, but over the long term, are in jeopardy because they have costs up front, and the benefits, come over, over a longer period of time. So some of those policies are in jeopardy, and I'm sure you're all aware of the proposed reduction in Mass Save in the House Energy Affordability Bill. So let's look at what happened. Clearly, climate change didn't go away. every year, we're just seeing more and more impacts and becoming more and more severe. So it certainly was not the case that that there was any reduction in the impacts of climate change. But what did happen is because of these shocks to the economy, starting around 2021, the economy and the overall public perception spiked around that time to become the most important issue for residents in the U.S. as a whole. And as a result of that, I think, and I think others do as well, that the percent of residents in the country who identified climate change as the most important issue peaked around 2021, at the time that our roadmap legislation was adopted, and has been receding ever since, and is now below what it was back in 2016, 2017, as the primary issue that residents across the country are concerned about. And it isn't that people have decided climate change is no longer an issue that they need to be concerned with. This graph here shows the percent of Americans who are either very worried or somewhat worried about climate change. You can see, in a sense, it did sort of peak back in 2021, as we saw in the last graph, but has not receded significantly since then. So what are the takeaways from all that? So first of all, costs increased for essentially everything, but in particular for some of the clean energy incentives. We looked at one example for offshore wind, and combined with that, the federal incentives were discontinued and essentially cut in almost all areas. As we saw earlier, support for state funding for energy efficiency and clean energy started to be looked at by our administration and by our legislators as potential areas where they could make immediate cuts that would have an impact on the day-to-day climate energy burden of residents in the state. And they began to look at the relative priority of the longer-term savings associated with these climate policies as compared to the short-term gains that might result from cutting those policies. And as we saw, overall concern about climate change hasn't really changed. It's just that the energy burden, the concern about the economy as a whole, has displaced climate change for many residents, and as a result, politicians as well. So I'm just going to show you one more slide before I'm going to pause for some questions and comments. When the roadmap legislation was adopted back in 2021, they set targets for 2025 and 2030. And as you can see in the graph there, the reduction in emissions between 2020 and 2025 was fairly modest. And then the curve really steepened between 2025 and 2030. In fact, if you look at those numbers, the reductions required to meet our 2030 goals require 2.5 times as much emissions reduction between 2025 and 2030 as were needed to meet our 2025 goals from 2020 to 2025. And that was set up, I think, because the belief was at the time that the concern about climate change would continue to be high, that support for action to combat climate change would accelerate through the decade, and it was reasonable to assume that our ability to reduce emissions would accelerate as well. So that, that assumption or belief is now somewhat in question. And with that, I'll pause and see if there's any comments or questions on what we've covered so far.
So if you'd raise your hand, if you have a question for Arnie, I will just kick it off with a quick observation on the slide where you showed what the top concerns are for residents of Massachusetts based on a survey. I did see that they're very close behind, and I'm not sure statistically significantly different are the other ones that we know everybody's concerned about. So climate, I don't think far and away is or the cost of utilities is not far and away the major thing. It's kind of very close to housing, groceries, and healthcare. I see a question from Lisa.
Yeah, hi everybody. Good afternoon. I just think that I just wanted to say that that first of all, Mike Barrett is not planning to propose any cuts to Mass Save, and so these proposed cuts by the House will have to go through reconciliation, and then there is a very large group of statewide climate organizations that are working on um, uh, pushing back on this House proposal, which would be really catastrophic for the whole entire building sector of the Massachusetts economy. It would touch on jobs. I mean, I'm an architect as well as running Zero Carbon MA, and so it would touch on jobs. It would touch on manufacturing. It would touch on work for plumbers, electricians, and it also uh, Mass Save. Actually, what Mass Save does is helps people become more energy efficient, which in turn lowers, as everybody knows, lowers their utility bills. But another thing that it does is that everyone benefits from Mass Save, whether that's through incentives for the passive house requirement of the specialized code, which requires multifamily housing over 12,000 square feet to be passive house. The incentives that are for passive house construction, or whether it's everybody here who's gotten reduced or subsidies for putting in insulation or heat pumps or any number of things. It that that increased energy efficiency reduces your own utility bills, but it also lowers the load on the grid for everyone. So that means that we have less load on the grid, less peak demand, and we have less need to expand the grid, which would be extremely costly. So there's so many things that would be detrimental, and Mass Save should never be something that's been tacked on to our utility bills. That's not where it belongs. That cost does not belong attached to our utility bills. It belongs as a totally different line item, and it should actually be expanded. And lastly, Mass Save just got retooled to be better for LMI communities and residents, and to yank the plug on Mass Save now seems really grossly unfair. It's also something that a lot of developers and affordable housing developers and also market rate developers have factored in to their plans in order to make their projects pencil out. So to all of a sudden like pull the rug out from them and say, oh no, we told you that you were going to have these programs were going to exist, and now we're saying nope, nope, they don't midstream. Again, that's just like a really detrimental. Sorry, Jim. I just can't
Yeah,
help myself when Massey comes up.
I hear you,
That's it.
Lisa. Lisa, yeah, no, great points. And I think you're mostly preaching to the choir, but we need to hear these messages time and again. Tony, and we'll
Yes,
turn it back to Arnie.
uh, good presentation, Arnie. Very interesting. I've been following it. The same questions have been haunting me. We use the Six Americas model from George Mason and Yale University, and on climate opinions, American opinions. And recently, the most recent one shows a Trump effect, that the popular opinion is going in the wrong direction. Not big, but it went from 54% combined people who were concerned and alarmed, went from 54% to 52%. I like to split that number in two. And one would be people like us who are familiar, let's say, well educated with the facts of what's happening, and we are seeing a super El Nino on the horizon for the summer. We're seeing all sorts of high risk or high damage things that are going to prove that the climate change is real and it's real serious, and we need to take action. The second group is the group that, we just elected a president. He's calling it a hoax. I mean, it can't be that bad. I don't want to spend my money in that direction anyway. And so you have two bodies of how they get their information and move forward. And I think that the I hate to say it, knowledgeable people are strong as ever, and the other people who are more on the fence are saying, "Well, it can't be true if our leader says that it's a hoax." So if the shit hits the fan, and with a super El Nino on the horizon, it appears to me that, man, we're not in a good place right now. So to me, I think your analysis is spot on, but where we go for the future, really, I've always been critical of the Democrats on the national front. When we had these presidential elections every 4 years, and nobody even brought up climate change. It wasn't a politically accepted issue, and so here we are.
Right. So, guys, I do see three other hands, Pamela, Mike, and Susan. In the interest of keeping Arnie on track, I ask you to save your comments and questions. There'll be time later for discussion. We really just wanted to stop briefly and see if there were clarifications. So I think, Arnie, let's move on, and you guys keep your thoughts. We'll be back.
All right, thanks, Roger. And I'm looking forward to the other comments and questions. I'll get back to where, okay, I think this is where the next slide, after we looked at our emissions targets. So how are we doing? So we really don't know how we're doing is the answer at this point. The state is required to publish annual statewide greenhouse gas inventories, but they're not required to publish them, during the year or even the year after that they're reporting on. So currently, we're in 2026. If you go on the Mass website, the latest state greenhouse gas inventory is from 2022. And so we look briefly at the 2025 emissions targets on the previous slide, we won't know whether we achieve those targets or not until, maybe 2027 or more likely 2028. So that puts us in a pretty tough position. So what's being done in lieu of having actual measurements of greenhouse gas emissions? We've been using so-called proxies. So what is being used to measure progress in the transportation sector primarily is the number of electric vehicles, either full battery EVs or plug-in hybrids that are on the road. In the building sector, we're looking at the number of heat pumps installed. And the EEA has been publishing an annual climate report card that you may have seen, which looks at how we're doing in each of these major sectors. But it's also based on proxies, so it doesn't really give us the real information that we're looking for, which is what our total emissions are and our sector emissions are. So we're working at a little bit of a disadvantage there. But let's take a look at what we do know. So we've already mentioned that in the electric sector, if you look at the way the CECP modeled how we were going to achieve the emissions reduction in the electric sector. And by the way, I think it's worth noting that when we looked at the emissions reduction in the electric sector in that graph earlier on in the presentation, and we saw that that was the major contributor to our being able to meet our 2020 emissions reduction target, that was during a period of time where our overall demand for electricity in the state, from the whole period from 1990 to 2020, was essentially flat to down. So any additional source of clean energy would reduce overall emissions. We're no longer in that period. That if we hit our targets in the transportation and building sector, then the total annual demand for electricity projected for 2030 will be about 30% higher than it is today. So it's we're not in this period any longer. We're just adding additional clean energy sources will reduce overall emissions. We have to add clean energy sources just to tread water. And if we don't add enough, we'll actually increase emissions because of our increased demand if we do hit our targets in the transportation and building sector. And what we've seen already is that the lion's share of our ability to meet that target was offshore wind, and it's essentially certain at this point that we'll only have achieved about a quarter of what was anticipated and was actually contracted for by 2030. And we may have new projects that are about to be started by then, or maybe even being built, but I can't see how we'll have additional projects online by that time. In the building sector, we do have a little bit of information about emissions. Mass Save reports for each of their 3-year plans what their target emissions reduction are, and then at the end of the 3-year plan, they report what they believe they've actually achieved. And the last 3-year plan was 2021 to 2024. And for that plan, the original goal was, I think, 1 million megatons of CO2 reduced annually by 2030. The Massey reported that it didn't achieve that goal. It was more like 800 million megatons. And of that, about 15 or 20% was reduction in electric use. So that actually doesn't count towards the building sector. And if you add up what was actually achieved through Mass Save during that last 3-year period, it amounted to about 6% of what needs to be achieved to hit our 2030 goal. And if you look at what the EEA's climate report card has to say, it's pretty pessimistic about the commercial sector. I don't think that would be a surprise. Most of what we hear about is, installing heat pumps in houses and residential buildings. And we're still in the early days of decarbonizing large buildings. In the transportation sector, we do have a very good proxy. The CECP, it requires just about 1 million electric vehicles on the road by 2030 to hit our target. That's both EVs and plug-in hybrids. As of January of this year, we had 16% of that, so that's about 160,000. So we're, we've got obviously a long way to go to achieve that 2030 target. So I think the way I look at it is, the outlook for 2030 is not promising in any of the major sectors. And one thing is that we are far from alone in facing these challenges. New York State has their own climate law. It's actually not as aggressive as the Massachusetts climate law. It's calling for a 40% reduction in emissions by 2030. But they now are, or at least the governor believes that they will not be able to achieve that target, and she is working to weaken the New York climate law, I think essentially by delaying their targets by I think it's about 10 years. You may be aware that one in the building sector, one of the key regulatory ideas was introducing something called a clean heat standard. We have been talking about that for several years now, and Vermont was the only state in the country that actually had legislated one, but that has now fallen apart. They are no longer moving ahead with their clean heat standard. And Rhode Island has also an aggressive climate law, but now their state agencies, at least if you follow what the Green Energy Consumers Alliance has to say, they feel that they've basically given up on their target. So we are not the only state that is facing really severe challenges in meeting our emissions reduction targets. I thought it would be useful to look at what are our constraints and options going forward from a sort of a high level view. And given the current situation in Massachusetts, I don't think we can propose regulations, policies, legislation that increase energy costs in the near term. I mean, it was reasonable to increase some energy costs through, bypassing the costs of the clean energy and energy efficiency policies. I mean, we talked about mass save, but there's also net metering, and there's the SMART program and the RPS program. And those are, costs are covered by ratepayers and have contributed, a significant percentage to customers' electric bills and gas bills. I don't think, that's tenable going forward, that we, increase the energy burden on residents. So whatever solutions we have, I don't think it's reasonable to increase the burden that already exists. So that says that these, whatever policies we have in place must be as cost effective as possible while keeping equity top of mind. And so what are some of the options that we have available to us? We'll talk about them in the different sectors in a little more detail going later on. One option, and we're not at the point yet where we want to talk about this, but some of our goals, I mean, I think what you saw earlier about how we're doing in the three main sectors is that we've really fallen far behind. So it could be necessary to delay achieving our targets in some of those sectors. We're going to talk a little bit about some new technologies that may help us move more rapidly, and as well as some new policies that are currently, not being promoted, I think, as much as they ought to be. And I think part of that, and we'll see that a little bit later, is the incentive structure. I think particularly in the building sector could be improved to reduce emissions faster in the building sector with the same number of dollars. And of course, we have legislative mandates like BERDO. If you're not familiar with BERDO, it's a regulation for Boston. There's similar ones in Cambridge and Newton, I believe, which requires a reduction in emissions from large buildings over time. We'll see how well that goes. I am familiar a little bit with a BERDO-like regulation in New York City, which is currently being revisited. So it's not clear that that is going to make as much progress as has been hoped. I was gonna switch over to the electric sector, but before I'll do, I'll pause for a couple of minutes and see if there's any questions on what I just covered, and maybe some of the questions that we didn't have time for earlier.
Yeah, Arnie, I think in the interest of time, we might skip this break and have you move into the different sectors. You're not too far behind, but we're getting close to the 5 o'clock hour. So why don't you go ahead and move on and maybe take a break after the electric sector?
All right, sounds good. Thanks, Roger. So for the electric sector, one of the things I thought would be useful to take a look at the outset is, what are the costs of the different forms of clean energy that we're currently focusing on, solar and wind. And solar is in this graph, and this is from a corporation called Lazard that publishes an annual levelized cost of energy. You can see there's a very almost dramatic difference between residential rooftop solar and utility scale solar. Not as dramatic difference, but still a significant difference between onshore wind and offshore wind. And one of the things I'd like to point out, you can see there's a very wide bar particularly for solar. And the main reason for that is that this cost of energy is across the entire country. And particularly for solar, as you probably are aware, the efficiency of solar in the southern portions of the country is much higher than it is in Massachusetts. So, for example, the same solar installation in Texas would produce about 50% more electricity on an annual basis than that same installation in Massachusetts. So that accounts for most of this wide band that you're seeing, both for utility and residential solar. In Massachusetts, the cost would be towards the right of that bar, and in areas like Texas, it would be towards the left of the bar. But in any event, what this graph is showing is that the two least expensive forms of clean energy are utility scale solar and onshore wind. Offshore wind is about in the middle, and residential rooftop solar is the most expensive form of clean electricity. Now, this chart comes from an economic study done by ISO New England, where they looked at or created a model based on projected costs of various sources of clean energy, as well as the cost of integrating that clean energy onto the grid, and produced this bar chart where the dark green represents the period of time where this particular source of clean energy is the most preferred. And as it gets lighter and lighter green, it's less preferential. And what their economic study concluded was that, during, currently and through 2040, actually for land-based wind through 2050, that is a highly preferred form of clean energy. From the previous slide, that shouldn't be a surprise, because onshore wind is the least expensive form of clean energy, and it's, fairly steady. It doesn't have quite the capacity factor of offshore wind, but still very good. Utility scale solar is preferred through the 2040s, when we have enough that it begins to get curtailed significantly. Offshore wind becomes a preferred source of clean electricity in the mid 2030s, which might be a surprise, but given all of the work that has been being done in offshore wind in Massachusetts. And then nuclear in the form of small modular reactors becomes a preferred source of electricity in the mid 2040s out through 2050, and that's to provide a source of baseload electricity. So if we had the ability to have projects using those sources of clean energy, the economic study from ISO New England would suggest to us which ones to focus on during which period of time. But we have some real challenges and barriers to follow the economic study that was done by ISO New England. First of all, as we've already seen for offshore wind, we've got a series of issues with pricing and now siting and the very severe federal opposition to offshore wind. And I think as most folks are aware, onshore wind at any reasonable scale is just not practical in Massachusetts. Similarly for solar, the types of utility scale solar projects that are done in the South and the Southwest, where you have a solar farm that is literally 1,000 acres or more, that's just not viable in Massachusetts. That we just don't have the land that could potentially be used for that size of solar installation. So we're really limited to the smaller distributed solar projects. That includes the rooftop solar, brownfields, community solar projects. But they are, as we've seen, significantly more expensive than utility scale solar and require significant incentives to make them financially attractive to the folks who are going to install them. So we have the SMART program, we have net metering, which makes these small scale solar installations financially attractive. But the incentive is paid for by the homeowners or whoever is paying the utility bill. And it's estimated that for each gigawatt of additional solar of this smaller scale type would add about a cent per kilowatt hour to our utility bills. And as we saw earlier, the CECP is calling for an additional 4 gigawatts of solar by 2030. So if that estimate is more or less correct, that would suggest that that would add an additional 4 cents per kilowatt hour to our electric rates, which would be on the order of, a 15 to 20% increase, which would violate our constraint that we cannot increase the energy burden for residents. So, and we're also, because of the impacts that we looked at earlier, we're looking at the potential for a reduction in some of these incentives. There's a current DPU order, it's called 25200, which is tasked with reviewing all possible changes to the components of our electric rate, looking for ways that we can in the near term reduce our electric rates. So one of the areas that DPU 25200 will be looking at is net metering. You may be aware that California, which had been leading the country in small scale rooftop solar installations, reduced their incentives dramatically, I think by about 75% for net metering in that state. So I don't know that we'd be looking at anything as draconian as that, but I think we may need to if the incentives are reduced in order to keep these small scale projects financially viable, then the cost of the projects has to be reduced as well. So what are we looking at for short-term solutions? We don't have, or we won't have additional offshore wind by 2030. There is a project that has been being discussed for several years in Maine for 1.2 gigawatts of onshore wind, which is supported by most of the governors in New England. And that may indeed go forward this time. It would require, a new transmission line from Maine to the other New England states. There's also been a agreement, partnership with the Canadian Maritime Provinces, who are not facing all of the headwinds that we are for offshore wind. And they may be developing some offshore wind capacity that we could tap into by 2030. For solar, we have to be focusing on these smaller scale distributed solar. And as we saw on the last slide, if the incentives for the smaller scale solar are reduced in order to make these projects financially attractive, the cost of the project itself has to get reduced as well. And one of the things that you may be aware of is that the cost of smaller scale solar, particularly things like rooftop solar and canopies, are primarily associated with what's called soft cost. It's not the cost of the panels themselves. Those costs have come down, as I'm sure you're aware, dramatically. The cost of the panel itself is really no longer a driving force behind the overall cost of the installation. What are the so-called soft costs? That has to do with permitting and inspection, labor, and marketing that make up 60 to 70% of the cost of these projects. And there are currently at least in the House affordability bill, and I would expect to see that and more in the Senate version when we see it, regulations that would make the permitting and of these smaller scale solar installations more streamlined and hence less expensive. There are other regulations that could be put in place, and I think we need to focus on those to get the cost of these smaller scale solar installations down to what they need to be if the incentive structure is reduced. And then, whoops, I'm sorry, I went all the way. So then we have in the longer term, what can we do to meet the projected increased demand going forward beyond 2030 and the requirement that electricity be clean. So one idea that had been talked about for several years, I haven't heard much talk about it more recently, was to import solar and wind from outside the ISO New England region. As we already saw in the Midwest and Southwest, both solar and wind are significantly less expensive than they are in our region. And on top of that, they're complementary to the generation of electricity from renewables in the New England area. So that for example, the daily production of solar in the western part of the country is about 3 hours more than it is in where we are. And there's also seasonal variations that are complementary, and obviously weather variations. When it's raining in New England, it's probably, or could be sunny in Arizona. So it's a very attractive idea, but it would require these so-called high voltage DC transmission lines, being run from where that energy is generated to where, it would be used in Massachusetts, and it would required these long distance transmission lines. Technically possible, it's being done in other parts of the world, particularly in China, but the permitting and political challenges, to date have made actually, building these long distance high voltage transmission lines a non-starter, but that may change in the long term. And then there's, I think, reason to be cautiously optimistic about new sources of clean energy. I think we've all heard about these small modular reactors building nuclear more cost effectively. There seems to be a possibility that fusion will actually happen, that, by perhaps the mid 2030s, there will be commercial scale fusion reactors that do come online and don't have some of the negatives associated with fission. And then there's a whole new area that's emerged in the last couple of years called enhanced geothermal. Initially, it was thought that it might not be a good source of clean energy in the New England region because of our geology, but our new techniques are being developed that may, by the late 2030s, early 2040s, make this really deep boreholes, that are, a couple miles down, financially feasible in our region. So I think that's the end of electricity,
Yeah.
Roger.
Yes, and what I'm going to suggest is, in the interest of time, again, that we take some questions and comments now, and if we can, we'll leave a few minutes at the end to cover buildings and transportation. But that might have to come at another time, if that's okay with you, Arnie. I think that folks had a lot of questions and concerns that they might want to bring up, and we'll see how that goes, and then we can move on to transportation and buildings if we have time. So, questions, Lorna.
Hi, thank you, Arnie. A lot of information. A couple of things. Can you speak to the impact of GSEP in terms of ratepayer costs? And well, let's just go with that for now.
Well, in terms of ratepayer cost, I think and here I'm going to be relying on a post by Senator Brownsberger from last year, where he showed the components of natural gas from, I think it was National Grid. It could have been Eversource. But at that point in time, the contribution of GSEP, and here, Lana, I'm going to be trying to remember as best I can. The direct cost of GSEP was not enormous. It was, on the order of 7 or 8% of the gas bill. But there's and I think one of the things that was pointed out is that doesn't capture the entire impact of GSEP. There's a concept called I think it's called the rate base.
Yes.
Where all of the capital projects that utility has undertaken are added to their rate base and becomes, part of their cost going forward, and then they have a allowed return on equity for that rate base. So I think and Lana, I would be out of my league to try to guess what the contribution of GSEP has been so far to the increase in the rate base for natural gas. So that's, and maybe someone else has a better idea than I do.
Well, the topic is really the electric costs, and I understand that, but I'm thinking about ratepayers in general and what we pick up from the industry. you touched on the issue, the cost of the costs that are associated with permitting, et cetera. And what stands in the way? Why can't those permitting processes be eliminated or reduced? They add a significant cost to different projects. Why can't that be reduced?
They should be able to be reduced. One of the, I talked about it as it applies to small scale solar, particularly rooftop solar. And right now, every community in Massachusetts has their own regulations for installing rooftop solar. So you go from one town to the next, and the solar installer is, working with, a different set of permitting regulations. So, one of the things that could, really help that issue in particular is if the state, imposed or had a common set of permitting regulations across every community.
Right. That's kind of what I'm getting at. Thank you.
Alan, do you have a question?
Yeah, thanks, Roger. Arnie, at some point in your last segment, you talked about options, one of which was delay in reaching our roadmap goals. In other words, amending the roadmap bill. But you didn't really talk about that option at all. It's been something I've been thinking about, maybe even slightly advocating for, given that we really are out there. We're living with a roadmap log set of goals that are more stringent than California, than New York State. I've been looking at the Washington state law, which sets targets for 2030 at 45% below 1990. We're at 50%. And in 2040, they're at 70%, whereas we're at 75. But then when they get to 2050, they set a goal of not just net zero with a maximum of 85% like we have. They have a maximum of 95%. So in other words, they're more lenient early on and more stringent as you get toward 2050. I don't know if you have any thoughts about it, but
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point, Alan. And I don't know if you remember at the time that the roadmap bill was, signed by Governor Baker, he had what was it? Rejected, what's the word? The bill twice already. And what he was proposing at that time was, rather than a 50% reduction by 2030, that we target a 45% reduction by 2030. And Secretary Theourides at the time, was, really saying, this could make a big difference. It would cost a lot less. It would be an easier target to achieve. And we could still achieve net zero by 2050. So at the time, I had sympathy for Secretary Theourides. I thought it was a pretty aggressive goal, particularly for 2030, that we'd already adopted. So, as you said, other states have adopted their own targets, for different times, most, if not all of which are not quite as aggressive, particularly for 2030, as ours are. So, I don't think it would be the end of the world to think about, revisiting what was said back in, 2020, 21, about, what our target, particularly our nearer term target, ought to be.
even the long-term target, Arnie, I think needs to be looked at.
Yeah.
The 2050 target, where we only have to achieve, 85% below 1990. It was thought, I think, at that point that we would be relying on offsets to really get to where we needed to be with net zero. And since then, we've all learned that the offset uh, market is primarily a scam. And we really ought not to be living with that 85% number.
Again, I agree with you, Alan. I think all of the reports that I've seen on what we, should or might be able to sequester in 2050 in our state are, rather than, 15% of our 1990 emissions, it's more like half of that. And and you're right. I mean, there was an idea that we would be able to, not the standard offset, but that maybe Maine would have some excess sequestration that they could sell to Massachusetts, just like we're buying RECs from onshore wind from Maine. We'd be buying some sort of credit from Maine for their additional forests, but I haven't seen that that's gone anywhere. So I agree with you.
Yeah, Pamela, you have a question.
Yes, a lot of your excellent arguments are economic arguments, the various costs of various things, but they're not including the costs of not doing it and the externalized costs of extreme weather, forest fires, and so on, that these expenses to decarbonize the entire energy supply will prevent. And this is we need to be more economically, politically effective. There's so many of us, we are, like you said, preaching to the choir here. If we grouped together and said, the reason the bottle bill isn't being passed, for instance, is because the legislature is corrupted by the fossil fuel industry, and we're fed up, and we pledge not to vote for anyone who doesn't vote for our bills. Until we actually group together and exert political power, we won't have any. Yeah. I think we should do the same with the environmental groups getting together a super PAC.
Yeah. We have a lot. We have a lot of work to do.
We do. And Pamela,
the thing is that a lot of these these things about the relative costs are simply wrong. We are already at solar, wind, and battery being the cheapest form of energy in totality, even cheaper than hydro. Research into modular nuclear and so on is fine, is good thing, but we already could have a distributed grid, solar, wind, and battery, with just a little bit of economic incentive, like we had in these programs that they're taking away.
So Arnie, what about what Pamela's saying about distributed solar, wind, and battery? Are there actually better economics there than what you might have shown on your graph about the high cost of distributed solar?
Well, I think
I'll put a link to a video that you guys should watch.
I do know. I mean, just in terms of installation cost, what I was showing earlier was the annual or the latest Lazard levelized cost of energy for different sources of clean energy. It does, it shows what it shows, that these smaller scale solar installations are actually much more expensive than the utility scale solar, and we just happen to be in a region where these very large scale utility scale solar installations are just not feasible. They're not practical. Okay. But just Pamela, I think what we've seen, and we've talked to some of our legislators about what's been happening in the last year or so with this whole energy affordability. I wouldn't put the onus entirely on our administration or entirely on our legislators. They are hearing from, their constituents who are saying, we just can't afford this. And
But that's
Yeah.
not true. We can't afford not to.
well, the not to part I agree with, but people are looking at, their pocketbook and paying for, their energy bills this month and next
Yes.
month. And
Yeah.
that's what our
I,
politicians are reacting to, I think.
right.
Yeah,
I-
but that's the fossil fuel industry talking point
Yeah.
framing.
Okay.
We have to fight that as well.
I think we would all agree. We need to fight back. We need to change the conversation completely. I'm not sure anybody here would disagree with that. But Arnie, there is about 5 minutes left. I don't see any other questions. Could you quickly run us through
Okay, I'm sorry.
what's going on with transportation,
Yeah,
and
let's-
maybe
let's-
sticking to the solutions that you're preferring, or the key
so-
points, top points?
yeah,
Just move us through
okay.
quickly.
I will do that. Thank you, Roger, for keeping me on time. So in the transportation sector, we've listed, three barriers. One that I think we're aware of for, several reasons. I think I would, put it mostly at the feet of our current federal administration, but the adoption of electric vehicles has slowed from the pace that it was at in the last few years. We still have the cost of purchasing an electrical vehicle being, still significantly higher than a comparable gas-powered vehicle. And this whole issue of range anxiety and charging infrastructure, is still very much front and center. And, I'm thinking particularly about folks who, don't have the ability to have their own, charging, ability to charge. People who, park in a large parking lot in a large rental building or condominium, or people who, just live in the city and have street parking. For those folks, for the most part, having an electric vehicle with the current range and the current charging capability is not as easy as having a gas vehicle. And so those are the barriers and challenges that we've identified. We think that, those all of them are going to be addressed, in the next 5, 6, 7 years. That the projection is, even with the pull back of some EVs by some of the larger car companies, that by late 2020s, early 2030s, that an EV should be priced, comparably to or lower than a similar gas vehicle. I think we've all seen the impact of the war in Iran on energy costs, particularly the price at the pump, and that's giving a boost to EV sales. There are new technologies that are emerging that will address both the range and charging issues. We're looking at ranges that are getting up to 600 miles with new battery technology, and looking at so-called ultra-fast charging, which is already being rolled out in China. And with those ultra-fast charging stations, it's pretty much like going to a gas station. You plug your car in and, 5-10 minutes later, you're ready to go. So I think those would address the concerns, the barriers that we currently have. And I think that the technology as it's emerging now will take care of those barriers. Maybe not as quickly as needed to meet our 2030 goals, but I think we're set up to meet them. And although the federal rebates have gone away, the More EV program at the state level is still in place. Buildings, I think, Roger, we're going to have to. That's a longer discussion. I can see we're almost at the half hour.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
I
So
think we might-
and so that seems reasonable. Arnie, are there further questions, discussion, comments? We're getting nearing the hour. We can stay on a little bit longer. Arnie, are you able to stick around a little longer?
I can stay on.
But let's those who really would like to get a question in before the formal end of our discussion, please speak up now. Any questions, concerns?
I see Tina has her hand up.
Tina.
Hi, yes, thank you. I apologize for not being technically savvy before on my phone. Thank you, Arnie, for putting all of this together. I'm just wanting to make a comment that the bottom line is money and funding. And if we had money to make this transition, we wouldn't be stuck where we are. I think that we need to be working more on that. And maybe we need to pass another millionaire's tax in Massachusetts. We need to step up somehow to get more funding to get all this to happen more quickly.
Yeah. So I know there were some folks out there who had their hands up earlier. Mike Duclos was out there, a couple of other folks. I know, Pamela, you did have a chance to speak up. Are there others who would like to make some comments or ask Arnie any questions at this point? And Lorna, you're up again.
Yes, it's me again. Tina, I want to thank you for that comment because honestly, I listen to these presentations. There's so much information. It's so well prepared. It feels Kafkaesque to me. It really does, because what we're talking about, we continue to operate within the system that exists, which is the system that we have. But we really need to be looking beyond that. What are the basic reasons why we're stuck where we are? It's why I brought up the GSIP issue, because it has to do with how ratepayers get stuck with the costs of a public-private entity. And until we start addressing the issue of money, in terms of whom should be responsible, we're not going to get anywhere. We're going to continue, and we can reduce the goals, sure, but that's not going to slow down climate change, and we're just going to be hit with more and more. So those are my comments. That's all I have to say. Thank you, Tina.
Thank you, Lorna. Okay, any other comments or questions for Arnie? Okay, seeing none. Tina, did you want to?
Pam has her hand
Pamela,
up.
you got your hand up. You got the last word.
I just want to point out that the cost of doing residential solar versus the cost of the utility grade solar may be higher, but it isn't higher for us, for the ratepayers, because all you need to do is a small incentive for the wealthy homeowners with the right attitude to make it good for them to invest in it, their own, which, like you so wisely pointed out, not only reduces the homeowner's cost, but also benefits the entire community. So a little nudge, a little economic nudge in terms of the incentives for homeowners to invest in their own systems benefits everyone else, and makes every time a homeowner builds a little energy plant on their house, that's less for the community to have to buy and finance. It's very inexpensive to do it that way. When you compare the total costs of things, that's not including who's the one that pays for those costs.
Okay.
Incentivize the homeowner. You don't pay that cost, they do.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think the point, Pamela, and I guess we are beyond the time, is that the homeowner is, is paying a cost that will give him or her a reasonable return on investment for that solar rooftop or solar installation. But in order for that return to be reasonable today, the incentives have to be, fairly significant. And the cost of those incentives, if you just take and you may, this may be just a myopic view, but those incentives are being, paid for directly by the utilities in the form of, net metering and the SMART program. But then they recoup those costs by having other ratepayers, essentially pay for the incentive that was provided to that homeowner who did install solar, and that's what this EPU Order 25-200 is looking at.
Well, but remember that investment we now no longer have to make in changing off of fossil fuel because the homeowner has done that. We should always make it economically better for anyone to invest in solar and battery than it should, as long as it's cheaper to heat with gas and you're not required by law to do heat pump, we will continue to have heating with gas for the people that don't care, that don't. And we have to make the economic incentives to do the right thing homeowners, not just the utilities. The utilities are captured by the fossil fuel industry. This whole argument on affordability, that's because they found out through focus groups that that's the argument that works to stop the investment in decarbonized energy.
I think we're about past time here. It's a great discussion.